Picture this. It's midday, somewhere in ancient southern Africa, around 100,000 years ago, and an ancient woman is crouching beside a still pool of water, looking at something that has, in its quiet way, been genuinely confusing to think about ever since she first noticed it as a child. Her own reflection. It moves when she moves. It does exactly what she does. It appears to be looking back at her with the same focused attention she's directing toward it. And somewhere in the background of her consciousness, in whatever rich, complex internal experience ancient human minds were capable of, a question is forming that she almost certainly doesn't have the specific vocabulary to articulate, but is experiencing in some direct, felt way nonetheless. Is that me? And if that's me, then what exactly is me? And how do I know that me is actually real? Nearby, a baboon is also drinking from the pool. It glances at its own reflection, registers it briefly, responds to it as it would respond to another baboon at close range, a brief territorial assessment, and then, apparently satisfied that the competitor in the water is not actually worth engaging with, returns to drinking. The reflection doesn't confuse it. It doesn't fascinate it. It doesn't trigger anything resembling the recursive self-examination that the woman beside the pool is experiencing. The baboon is real in every biological, physical sense. Whether it knows it is real in any meaningful sense is a different, much stranger, much more interesting question. So here's what this video is actually about, and it's one of the most genuinely profound, most philosophically rich questions you can ask about the animal mind and its relationship to the ancient human mind. Do animals even know they are real? Do they have any experience of their own existence as a thing that exists? Do they experience themselves as subjects, as the specific entity having their specific experiences? Or is the subjective sense of being real, the felt awareness of your own existence as a real, ongoing, experiential entity, something that might actually be much rarer than we tend to assume, possibly uniquely or near uniquely human in its full, explicit form? Stick around because the answer touches on some of the deepest questions in all of cognitive science and philosophy of mind, connects directly to what ancient humans were apparently doing differently from every other species around them, and might make you think about your own sense of existing in a way that's genuinely uncomfortable in the most interesting possible way. Let's start by establishing what we're actually asking when we ask whether animals know they are real, because the question sounds almost silly until you think about it carefully, and then it becomes one of the strangest, deepest questions imaginable. Knowing you are real, in the sense this question is reaching toward, isn't about having a body that exists or sensory experiences that occur. Every biological entity has those, and their having them doesn't require any knowledge of their own existence at all. A bacterium responds to chemical gradients in its environment without any knowledge of being a bacterium. A deer experiences sensory input and produces behavioral responses without necessarily having any experience of itself as the deer having those experiences. What we're asking about is something considerably more specific, the recursive, self-reflective awareness that there is a subject having the experience, that this subject is you, that you exist as an ongoing, continuous entity distinct from but related to its past and future selves, and that this existence is something you know about rather than simply something that is occurring. This is what philosophers of mind often call phenomenal self-awareness or reflective consciousness, and researchers studying it have found that the evidence for its presence or absence in different species is considerably messier, more uncertain, and more genuinely fascinating than popular accounts of animal intelligence typically suggest. Let's talk about the mirror test, because this is the most famous, most widely cited experimental probe for self-awareness in non-human animals, and understanding both what it actually shows and what it doesn't show is genuinely essential for thinking about this question clearly. The mirror test, developed by researcher Gordon Gallup in the 1970s, works by applying a mark to an animal's body in a location visible in a mirror but not visible directly, then exposing the animal to a mirror and observing whether the animal touches or examines the mark on its own body in response to seeing the reflection, behavior that would indicate the animal recognizes the reflection as representing itself rather than another individual. The results of mirror testing across animal species have produced a genuinely interesting, genuinely debated pattern. Great apes, specifically chimpanzees, orangutans, and gorillas, with some individual variation, generally pass the mirror test. Bottlenose dolphins and orcas pass versions adapted for aquatic animals. Elephants, tested with large enough mirrors, show mirror self-recognition behavior. Certain magpies, remarkably, have passed versions of the test. Most other animal species tested, including most other primates, dogs, cats, and a wide range of other mammals and birds, typically fail the standard version of the test, treating the reflection as another individual rather than as a representation of themselves. But here's where it gets genuinely interesting and genuinely contested. What does passing the mirror test actually tell us about self-awareness in the sense our original question is asking about? The mirror test identifies a specific, narrow behavioral capability, recognizing a visual representation of one's own body as representing oneself rather than another individual. This is genuinely impressive when it occurs, and its relatively rare distribution across species is informative. But the gap between recognizing your visual reflection as representing yourself and actually having a rich, continuous, phenomenally felt sense of your own existence as a real, ongoing subject is potentially enormous. Passing the mirror test might indicate something important about self-concept in a cognitive sense without necessarily indicating anything about the phenomenal, felt experience of knowing you are real in the way we opened this question. And failing the mirror test doesn't necessarily mean an animal has no form of self-awareness at all, since various researchers have pointed out that mirror self-recognition specifically is a visual, spatial task that some otherwise sophisticated animals might fail for reasons unrelated to the presence or absence of any form of self-awareness, particularly species whose primary sensory experience is dominated by non-visual modalities like olfaction, where a mirror is simply an uninformative object. Let's talk about something genuinely fascinating here regarding body ownership and the proprioceptive sense of inhabiting a specific body, because this represents a more basic, potentially more broadly distributed form of self-awareness than the mirror test targets. Every animal with a nervous system sophisticated enough to coordinate multi-limb movement has some form of internal body map, a neural representation of where the body's parts are and what they're doing that allows coordinated action without visual monitoring of every limb position. This proprioceptive body map is, in a very basic sense, a form of self-representation, a neural model of the self as a physical entity with specific spatial properties, and researchers studying consciousness have proposed that this basic body map represents the most evolutionarily ancient root of what eventually, in sufficiently complex nervous systems, develops into full phenomenal self-awareness. In this view, the felt sense of being real, of being a subject inhabiting a specific body having specific experiences, isn't some binary property that either exists fully or doesn't exist at all. It's the developed end of a continuum that begins with basic proprioceptive self-modeling, and gradually, through evolutionary complexity, adds layers of representational richness, reflective depth, and eventually the kind of explicit narrative self-awareness that appears most fully developed in humans, with various animal species occupying different points on this continuum depending on the complexity and organization of their nervous systems. This view is genuinely important for how we should think about the ancient human story specifically, because it suggests that the difference between ancient human self-awareness and the self-awareness of other animals sharing their environment wasn't a sudden, categorical leap from no self-awareness to full self-awareness, but rather an extension of pre-existing self-awareness capabilities to a level of reflective depth, narrative integration, and temporal extension that appears to be qualitatively different from what any other species demonstrates. Let's talk about something genuinely fascinating here regarding what might be the most direct, most compelling evidence for the specific, distinctively human form of self-awareness, which turns out not to come from laboratory experiments at all, but from the material remains ancient humans left behind. We've discussed throughout this entire series various pieces of evidence for ancient human inner life, burials, cave art, personal ornamentation, deliberate ceremony, and what's striking about all of them from the specific perspective of self-awareness is that every single one of these behaviors reflects something that requires a very specific cognitive capability. The ability to think about yourself from an outside perspective, to imagine how you appear to others, to represent yourself as a specific individual with a specific identity that persists through time and has significance that extends beyond your immediate present experience. Personal ornamentation, The pierced shells and bone beads and ochre decoration we discussed in our attractiveness video only makes sense as a behavior if the person adorning themselves has a representation of themselves as a specific entity with an appearance that can be modified and that modifies how they appear to others. This requires self-awareness not just in the basic body map sense, but in a socially reflective sense. The ability to model yourself as an object of other people's perception and to deliberately manage that perception through self-presentation. This is remarkably sophisticated self-awareness, requiring exactly the kind of recursive self-modeling. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content, covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. That the question, do I know I am real, is ultimately about. Burial practices are equally revealing from this perspective. Burying a person carefully with objects, with apparent attention to their dignity and continued existence in some form, requires modeling that person as a self that had specific significance, that existed as a real, individual, continuous entity whose reality extended beyond their present physical state. The people doing the burying had to model themselves as selves capable of loss, capable of grief over the ending of another self's existence. This is self-awareness extended through social relationships and across time in exactly the way that distinguishes human self-awareness from the more limited present moment forms of self-awareness we see evidence for in other species. Let's address something genuinely important here regarding what ancient humans were apparently experiencing that other animals around them were not, because this connects the philosophical discussion directly to the practical, lived reality of ancient human inner life. The best current thinking on this suggests that human self-awareness isn't simply more of the same self-awareness other animals have. It's qualitatively extended in at least 2 specific dimensions that appear genuinely unusual, if not unique: temporal extension and narrative integration. Temporal extension means that human self-awareness isn't limited to the present moment, but extends across time, connecting current experience to remembered past experiences and anticipated future experiences in a continuous self-narrative. The ancient human sitting by a pool looking at her reflection isn't just having a present moment experience of a reflected image. She's having a present moment experience that connects to her memory of seeing this reflection before, her understanding that this reflection will be there again tomorrow, her awareness of herself as a continuous entity whose existence spans a past and will span a future. This temporal continuity of self-awareness, the sense of being a specific individual whose existence extends across time, appears to be dramatically more developed in humans than in other animals based on everything behavioral and neuroscientific research has established. Narrative integration means that human self-awareness isn't just temporally extended but narratively organized, structured around a coherent story of who you are, where you came from, what you've done, and what you mean. A story that synthesizes past experiences, present identity, and future intentions into a coherent self-concept that persists as a consistent framework across the changing circumstances of daily life. This narrative self-awareness, the sense of being a character in a story that is your own life, appears to be directly connected to the language and storytelling capabilities we've discussed throughout this series as central to ancient human culture, since narrative requires and enables exactly the kind of temporally integrated, coherent self-representation that distinguishes human self-awareness most clearly. Let's now address something genuinely fascinating and genuinely difficult: the hard problem of consciousness and why it means we can never fully answer the question this video is asking, at least not with the tools currently available to us. The hard problem, as philosopher David Chalmers named it, is the question of why any physical process, any pattern of information processing in any nervous system, gives rise to subjective experience at all. Why is there something it feels like to see red, rather than simply a neural process that responds to certain wavelengths of light? Why is there something it feels like to exist, rather than simply a biological process that behaves as if it exists? This problem is genuinely hard in the technical philosophical sense because it appears to be, in principle, resistant to any purely objective, third-person scientific answer. We can study the neural correlates of consciousness in extraordinary detail. We can map which brain processes are associated with reported conscious experience in humans. We can observe behavior in animals that is consistent with or inconsistent with various forms of self-awareness. What we cannot do, using any currently available method, is directly access the subjective experience of any other being, human or animal, to confirm whether and what kind of phenomenal experience is accompanying the physical processes we can observe. This means that when we ask whether animals know they are real, we're asking a question that bumps directly into the hard problem. We can establish fairly clearly that most animals don't show behavioral evidence of the kind of reflective, temporally extended, narrative self-awareness that humans demonstrate. We can make reasonable inferences about what levels of self-awareness different nervous system architectures are likely to support. What we cannot do is definitively confirm or deny whether there is something it feels like to be a specific animal, whether there is any felt sense of existence from the inside, however different from human self-awareness it might be, accompanying the physical processes occurring in that animal's nervous system. Let's bring this back to the ancient human story one more time, because it's where this entire conversation started, and it's where the most interesting, most practically important conclusions live. Ancient humans sitting around their evening fires, telling stories about things that happened before and anticipating things that would happen after, adorning themselves with carefully made jewelry that expressed something about their individual identity, burying their dead with attention and apparent grief, painting their experiences and their relationships with the world on cave walls in the deepest darkness available to them, were doing all of these things on the foundation of exactly the kind of temporally extended, narratively integrated, socially reflective self-awareness we've been discussing throughout this video. They knew they were real, not in any philosophically sophisticated, articulated sense, but in the most directly felt, most immediately experienced sense. They experienced themselves as specific, continuous, individual subjects having their specific experiences in a real world that existed independently of those experiences, alongside other subjects who were equally real. They experienced their own existence as something with significance, as something worth marking, worth maintaining, worth grieving when it ended in the people they loved, worth recording in pigment on cave walls in places so inaccessible that the act of recording itself was a deliberate, effortful statement about the importance of leaving a mark. The baboon drinking from the pool beside the ancient woman knew the water was real. It knew the territorial competitor in the water needed brief assessment. It knew its own hunger and the satisfaction of water meeting that need. Whether it knew it was real in the sense of being a continuous individual subject whose existence had significance beyond the present moment is a question that the behavioral evidence and the fundamental inaccessibility of another being's subjective experience makes genuinely impossible to answer with confidence. The woman looking at her reflection was doing something qualitatively different, not just cognitively more sophisticated, but experientially richer in a way that connected her to an entire human tradition of self-examination, self-expression, and self-questioning that has continued, unbroken, from that pool in ancient Africa to every philosophical tradition, every religious practice, every piece of art, every diary entry, every moment of existential reflection that the long human story has produced since. So do animals know they are real? Based on the mirror test evidence showing self-recognition in a small number of cognitively sophisticated species, but not in most, the theoretical framework of self-awareness as a continuum from basic proprioceptive self-modeling to full narrative self-awareness, the genuinely important distinction between present moment self-experience and temporally extended, narratively integrated self-awareness, the material evidence from ancient human behavior demonstrating exactly the kind of reflective, temporally extended, socially modeled self-awareness that distinguishes human self-awareness most clearly, and the fundamental, irreducible uncertainty introduced by the hard problem of consciousness. The honest answer is that some animals almost certainly have some form of self-awareness in a limited, present moment sense. Most animals probably don't have anything resembling the temporally extended, narrative self-awareness that humans so distinctively demonstrate, and whether any of them have a genuinely felt sense of their own existence from the inside is a question that may be permanently, irreducibly beyond our ability to definitively answer. What ancient humans had, and what their material remains demonstrate so clearly across hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated evidence, was precisely the most fully developed, most explicitly self-reflective, most temporally extended, and most narratively rich form of self-awareness the evolutionary history of this planet has so far produced. They knew they were real in a way that left marks on cave walls, that shaped how they treated their dead, that drove them to create beauty in the deepest, most inaccessible places available to them, that made their existence feel significant enough to document, to memorialize, and to share with the people around them. And as it turned out, with every generation that has come after them all the way to now.